Welcome to the H series of webinars. This series is aimed at new and aspiring sheep producers to give them a step up into the Queensland sheep industry. This hunger webinar is part 9 of the series and covers how the rumen works, meeting feed requirements, and monitoring the condition score of your animals. This webinar was delivered by Geoff Duddy from Sheep Solutions on the 7th of July 2021. This is clip 5 of 6 and covers the most important feed component, energy, the importance of digestibility, and the increase in energy requirements of ewes in lamb and the acidosis risk of different feeds.
Okay, so what's important? Energy. It's the most important feed component. Most people think it's protein, but it's not. Particularly in a drought, energy is the most important feed. The form in which a feed's energy is stored, whether it's in carbohydrate, protein, or oil, will influence things like metabolizable energy levels, rumen function, health. I've already mentioned acidosis risk, growth rates, and feed conversion efficiency. So energy per se is not just one form. It's a number of different forms which the ruminant can actually use. To give you an idea about the actual energy levels, if we look at the carbohydrates, say your cellulose, your starches, around 15 to 18 megajoules per kilo of dry matter. Protein will give you around about 1.5 times more energy. Oil will give you up around 2.2 times more energy. So excess protein can actually be used. It's not an efficient way of doing it because it takes a little bit of energy to utilize that excess protein, but it can be used. Oil and all feeds have a component of fat or oil in them. Not just the supplements that we give, but pastures and the like have got some component there. And it's a really good energy source, but there are limitations in that the ruminant doesn't really handle any more than around 7 or 8% total oil in the diet or fat in the diet. What's energy needed for? Muscle development, fat storage, maintenance, and growth. When you look at your feed test energy values, so if you send some feed away to get tested, when the energy value comes back, it's basically estimated by working out the digestibility of that feed. And I'll give you an example in a second. That also the form, as I mentioned before, whether it's starch, sugar, oils, and the like, that will really determine also the total energy in that feed test. If you look at this graph, we're going from the left-hand bottom axis to active or vegetative growth, so actively growing pasture, right across to dry stalks, which is dead pasture or stubble. To give you an idea, if we sort of grazing stubbles, and there's not much in the understory, just really a stubble there, you're lucky to get about 6 megajoules of energy. If it's dry feed, pasture base, 8 megs. As we move back towards a vegetative or growing state, our energy values improve as well. So as digestibility improves, energy improves. It's interesting, if we look at our pasture base here in Queensland, a lot of the tropical varieties, compared to our temperate grasses, they tend to have lower digestibilities, up by as much as 13% lower digestibility than a lot of the southern grasses. Lower energy, lower protein, lower minerals, lower leaf density, so it's harder for stock to actually harvest the leaf. Sheep are quite efficient at doing so compared to cattle though, and more crude fibre and longer time in the rumen. As a feed base, and sheep are good in that they can really select a lot of different nutrients or feed components, whereas cattle will struggle a bit, particularly on a lot of our tropical type grasses. But we just need to bear that in mind when it comes to what we need to feed and for what period. Just on this graph, I just want to show you the increase in energy requirement, and it's interesting that most people are actually in lactation or weaning, so we're down around this part of the curve. But if we look at scanning is around about 85 days pregnant, and if we look at the point of lambing, we have dry sheep. Remember I said that was about 8.3 megajoules of energy. And what does a single bearing ewe and a twin bearing ewe, what are their requirements at the point of lambing? Well, the single bearing ewe is around about 1.5 times the feed quality of a dry sheep, and a twin bearing ewe is around 2.5. And when we hit the peak of lactation around 3 or 4 weeks after lambing, after the lamb's born, we're looking upwards of 3.5 times the energy value that we need to get into, say, twin bearing ewes. That is why we need a condition score, particularly in late pregnancy, to make sure that they've got that energy on their back. They cannot physically get enough feed through the system to meet their requirements, maintain milk production and lamb growth rate. So we can supplement. We have a risk though with this acidosis risk. I prefer to call it acidosis than grain poisoning because it relates to acid production. It's not just a grain specific thing. The general rule of thumb is those ones at the top, wheat, triticale and corn, tend to be a higher acidosis risk compared to those at the bottom, something like oats or lupins. mainly because the ones at the top are higher in starch, which is that really dangerous one for acid production, and lower in fibre. And the ones at the bottom, they're lower in starch, higher in fibre and higher in oil. So they give the energy without necessarily that acidosis risk.
Thank you for watching this short clip. For more information, please visit www.leadingsheep.com.au.